Welcome to Lecture 6 for the Historical Books, BRITE Old Testament Class 510. We'll be continuing our way through 1st and 2nd Samuel today, looking specifically at 2nd Samuel and the reign of David, from his reign in Hebron over the tribe of Judah through his reign over all of Israel until near the end of his life in 2nd Samuel chapter 22. We'll also be considering the various characters that he comes into contact with, as well as the theology of this book. So let's get started. We learn in 1 Samuel chapter 31 that King Saul is dead, dying on the slopes of Mount Gilboa alongside his sons, including Jonathan. When the Philistines come to strip the bodies of the dead, they find Saul's body along with his sons and take them to Beth-shan, a town that's not that far from Mount Gilboa. There the bodies are placed on the wall of the town, presumably as a warning to others, and as a way to shame the descendants of Saul and the rest of Israel. This is what we've done to your king. The armor is then placed in a temple of Ashtaroth. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, however, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, come across the Jordan River to Beth-shan to reclaim the bodies of Saul and his sons. They then take them back to Jabesh-Gilead, where they bury them underneath a tamarisk tree. We're told that the men of Jabesh-Gilead do this, presumably because that is the town that Saul spared all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 11 from the attack of Nahash the Ammonite, when the men of Jabesh-Gilead had no idea that anybody would come to their defense, because why would they? Jabesh-Gilead is the one town that did not show up with the rest of the Israelites to sack the town of Gibeah and the rest of the Benjaminites at the end of the book of Judges. It was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who were put to death, and their wives were taken and given to the descendants of Benjamin in order to spare that tribe. It's possible that Saul's grandmother or another relative was originally a woman from Jabesh-Gilead. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Saul is enraged in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and goes to Jabesh-Gilead along with all Israel and rescues them from the Ammonites. Jabesh-Gilead then returns the favor here in 1 Samuel chapter 31 by delivering the bodies of Saul and his sons from the shame of being hung on the walls of Beth-shan. I have a little map here so that you can kind of get a sense of these particular cities and where they are in ancient Israel. The JG all the way to the east or to the right of the Jordan River is Jabesh-Gilead. The top oval is the Sea of Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias later on in history. The bottom oval is the Dead Sea, and the line connecting the two is the Jordan River. Just to the left of that line of the Jordan River, you see a capital letter B. That is the town of Beth-shan. That's where the Philistines hung the bodies of Saul and his sons. The G is Mount Gilboa. Just north of the G, we see E, which is Endor, and J, which is Jezreel. We also see an M to the left, that's Megiddo, which doesn't factor in this story, but does show up later in the Bible and kind of gives us a sense of where we are in the country of Israel. We also have, going down the left-hand side of this map, another E and a G. This is Ekron and Gath, the two cities of 5 out of all the Philistine cities. To the east of the G, or to the right of the G, is a J. That is the city of Jerusalem. Just outside Jerusalem, you may recall, is the city of Gibeah, not that far, and Gibeon, another town. South of the J, south of Jerusalem, is the H. This is Hebron. This is the town that David will reign in for almost 7 years. To the left, to the west of the H, is a Z for Ziklag. This is the town that is given to David in Philistine territory. And then all the way at the bottom is a B, which is Beersheba. This is the southernmost town in Israel and marks the border of Israel before you start getting into Egypt and Arab territory. So again, just an idea of our geography here in Israel. Of course, it does raise some questions because it suggests then that the Philistines went from the G on the far left, Gath on the western coast, north to Ekron, and then proceeded north as though they were going to Megiddo. They stop at a town called Ashkelon, which we don't know where Ashkelon is exactly, but presumably it's somewhere between the E and the M. They then turn east or to the right and head over towards the J, E, G, and B. We're kind of confused though. If they were trying to get to Saul in Gibeah, just north of the J, which is Jerusalem, although not yet in Israelite territory, Gibeah is where Saul is, so why not just go east across the country of Israel and take on Saul in Gibeah? Well, there is a reason for that, and it has to do with Israel's geography. The answer has to do with the topography of Israel. I've included here on the map another oval. This oval is representing the mountains of Israel. There are several different mountain chains or groups of hills. For instance, we've talked quite a bit about the hill country of Ephraim in the book of Judges in the beginning of 1 Samuel. This particular chain of mountains is sometimes called the Western Mountains, as it is in the topography map to the right, or the Central Highlands, among other names. The red dot here on the eastern side of these mountains is the city of Jerusalem. I've also added the city of Gath, which is the G on the western side of the oval, to the map on the right, the red dot that is due west of Jerusalem. As you can see, you could go from Gath, the red dot, straight east to Jerusalem. However, you would have to cross the mountains. We certainly know that this is possible, because in between Gath and Jerusalem is the town of Beth Shemesh, which is the town where the Philistines send the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel chapter 6, loading it on a cart, attaching 2 cows, and having those cows take it back to Israel. So it's possible. However, there's a big difference between a cart pulled by 2 cows and an entire army. Often what would happen is that the armies would march north along the western side of the mountains, and then as they reached the northern part of the mountains, turned to the east, headed over towards Jezreel and towards Mount Gilboa. Right on the tip of this particular oval, although it's not marked on my oval, but it is marked on the map to the right, is the city of Shechem, which literally means shoulder. This is the shoulder of these particular mountains on the far end, the far northern end of this chain of mountains. So as the men would leave Gath and go to Ekron, they would pass north, presumably would end up in Ashkelon, although we're not particularly sure where Ashkelon was, but it's north of Ekron. They would then turn to the east and go through a mountain pass into the valley of Jezreel. And this is where the battle would have taken place, in the valley of Jezreel on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. So geography plays a huge part in the history of Israel, requiring various peoples to go in particular directions in order to attack Israel. As I mentioned, the men of Jabesh Gilead, hearing that Saul is dead in Gilboa and that his body is on the walls of Bethshan, which is a great insult to Saul and his sons, the men of Jabesh Gilead progress west across the Jordan River, go to Bethshan, take the bodies from Bethshan, rescue them, and bury them. This is a great act on behalf of the men of Jabesh Gilead, because we're told that all of the towns along the Jordan River, even on the side of the Jordan River that Jabesh Gilead is located on, run. They basically fear the Philistines are going to invade all of Israel, and they abandon their towns. The men of Jabesh Gilead, though, very similar to commercials I'm sure you've seen for the U.S. Marines, do not run away from danger, but run directly towards it. The Philistines have apparently taken over some of these towns here in the valley of Jezreel and along the Jordan River, but the men of Jabesh Gilead are undaunted. They go, they take the bodies, and they escape with them and bury them. We're told that the armor is in a temple of Ashtaroth, which is presumably also in Bethshan, which is part of the problem in Israel, that they are still syncretistic. They have a temple of Ashtaroth, which the Philistines apparently recognize. We talked about this several weeks ago, that even though the Philistines worship Dagon, they have simply added Dagon into the rest of their pantheon of gods. Dagon is not the only Philistine god. In fact, Dagon is not even technically a Philistine god. It's been found in other areas of Mesopotamia and was probably transported to the region of the Philistines by the Philistines themselves. Ashtaroth is another popular goddess that is worshipped, and here we see a temple in Israel to this particular goddess. The men of Jabesh Gilead, though, go and rescue the body, and probably the armor as well, from the walls of the city and the temple, and restore them to a proper burial, honoring the bodies of Saul and his sons. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, we have an expectation of how the book is going to begin. We assume that David is going to be installed as king of Israel. After all, this is what he was anointed for back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, what Samuel promised from God. Instead, however, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we see the love that David had for Jonathan and Saul. And not just love for Jonathan and Saul, but a respect for Saul's office as the anointed one of God. We see an Amalekite messenger come and tell David in Ziklag that Saul has been killed. In fact, the Amalekite claims that he killed Saul. This is the third time that we've seen Saul close to death. He was shot with arrows and presumably was going to die. So instead, he asked his armor bearer to kill him so that it would not be said that the Philistines had killed him, which implies that the wound that he had received from the Philistines was a mortal wound and he was going to die. The armor bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his own sword. And now here we have the Amalekite saying that when he found Saul, Saul was still leaning on his spear. Again, we have a mention of Saul's spear, and not usually in a good way. Saul's spear is usually doing nothing. And yet here he is with his spear on the verge of death, and the Amalekite has to kill him. Presumably, the Amalekite is telling the truth, which would make the third time Saul has died, perhaps a companion to the 3 times that Saul becomes king, back in chapters 10 and 11. But here we have him die again. It is possible, however, that the Amalekite has completely made up the story, that Saul was already dead, and that the Amalekite thought that somehow he would gain a reward from David for being the one who actually put Saul out of his misery, for killing David's rival. David, however, instead flips it and says, well, you said you killed him, so therefore you deserve to be executed. And the Amalekite is struck down. Rather than praise, David gives the Amalekite the justice that is deserved. He struck the Lord's anointed. We then see a lament, not just for Jonathan, but a lament for Saul. Again, not a fake lament. After all, this is Israel's psalmist who is singing here. He composes a lament for Saul and Jonathan. And then we see him reward the men who went and captured the bodies at Beth-shan, the men of Jabesh-Gilead, rewarding them and thanking them for what it is that they have done for Saul. So we see David acting very noble here, very kingly, but we also see him not killing off the descendants of Saul and Jonathan completely, instead showing a love for the house of Jonathan and Saul, mourning for them, crying for them, and executing anyone who dared to touch them. It's a completely unexpected turn of events, because again, what we really anticipated seeing was David become king, but we really have to wait until chapter 2 before that will happen. In chapter 2, David is finally installed as king, however, only king of Hebron. All of Israel instead follows after the descendant of Saul, Ishbosheth, who is presumably one of the only sons that is left. We do find out later that the concubine of Saul had several sons. Those sons will be put to death at the end of 2 Samuel. But for now, Ishbosheth takes over. We also hear that Ishbosheth was 40 years old, which raises the question, why is it that Ishbosheth did not go to battle with the rest of his brothers and his father? We don't really know. Perhaps the text is suggesting that he's weak. We already had one weak king, but at least Saul went out to battle. Ishbosheth doesn't even go to battle. What also is surprising then is that Abner takes that son, the one who did not go to battle, and makes him king. This shows Abner's ability to be the kingmaker, and over time we begin to realize that Abner has ulterior motives in this. We see as Abner and Ishbosheth continue to have some conflict, as Abner goes and sleeps with Ishbosheth's concubines. Sleeping with the royal concubines was only done by the king, and in essence was the person who was sleeping with them saying, I'm king. So Abner here is declaring, by sleeping with these concubines, that he, not Ishbosheth, is the true power in northern Israel. He is the true king. And Ishbosheth simply stays out of his way because Ishbosheth is afraid of Abner. Abner then, because he's mad at Ishbosheth, decides that he's going to hand over the northern kingdom to David, and that David can become king. This is the outcome of that conflict between Abner and Ishbosheth. However, that creates a problem between Abner and Joab, because in the 2 years that Abner was actually serving Ishbosheth, they had had a battle, and Abner had killed Joab's brother. Joab, obviously, is very upset about that, so as Abner comes to talk to David about handing over the kingdom to him, Joab takes Abner apart silently and kills him, murders him in cold blood. Not in battle, but murders him in cold blood because Abner had killed Joab's brother in battle. So we see a rivalry that began with Abner and Ishbosheth that results in a rivalry between Abner and Joab and eventually causes Abner to be murdered, which then creates a rivalry between David and Joab, one that will continue in an uncomfortable way through the rest of 2 Samuel and all the way into 1 Kings, as Joab continues to murder anybody who gets in his way and is a rival to be the head of the armies of Israel. Joab is keeping his position as David's right-hand man, and curiously, David is allowing him to remain as his right-hand man, even though he has murdered Abner. After 2 years, Ishbosheth himself is murdered, and David is appointed as the king of all Israel. However, as I've mentioned before, David reigned in Hebron for 7 years. Ishbosheth is only king for 2 years. Where are the other 5 years? The reality is we don't know. Was Ishbosheth made the king of northern Israel at the first part of the 7 years that David is in Hebron, or at the end? I tend to think at the end, because Israel is absolutely terrified of the Philistines in the first couple years that David is reigning in Hebron. The Philistines have conquered Israel on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. They've obviously taken the town of Beth-shan and several of the other towns along the Jordan River, so that the north is full of Philistines. It's quite possible that it takes time for the Philistines to be driven out so that Ishbosheth can be set up as king, which makes me think that it's the end of the 7 years that Ishbosheth reigns for 2 years. Either way, by the end of the 7-year period, Abner and Ishbosheth are both dead, Ishbosheth being murdered by some of Saul's men, Abner being murdered by Joab. David and Joab take over all of Israel and begin to make preparations for solidifying the reign of David over the entire country. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, we read that David, at 30 years old, becomes the king of Israel in Hebron, serving over Judah as king, and then 7 years later, at the age of 36 or 37, becomes the king of all Israel. We also know that David, at the most, is 17 years old when he kills Goliath. David has 3 brothers older than him who are not qualified to fight in the battle because they're not 20 years old. So we know that David and his 3 brothers are all under 20, which means the most David could possibly be is 17. He's probably significantly younger, which suggests then that from the time David killed Goliath until the time that he actually becomes king is a minimum of 13 years. Again, we don't know where in that 13-year period that King Saul went crazy and started trying to kill David, but we do know that Saul appoints David to be over his armies in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and 19, which suggests that David is over 20 when that takes place, otherwise he couldn't even be in the army. This would also suggest then that there is a passage of time from the time that David kills Goliath until the time that he begins to fight the enemies of Israel under King Saul. Either way, though, we know that somewhere around 15 years passes from the time that David kills Goliath until he becomes king. Not a terribly long time to wait, especially since he's going to reign as king for 40 years, but I'm sure to David it felt like a long time. David finally becomes king. He's established as king. He then goes and takes the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites after they mock him and say he won't be able to get in. He does indeed get in. He also takes on King Hiram of Tyre as an ally, which shows how powerful the house of David has become, that Hiram is somewhat afraid of him and makes a treaty with him. We also see David handily defeat the Philistines. All of these serve to solidify his rise as king over all Israel, reigning in a new palace, in a new capital in Jerusalem. We also appear to see in 2 Samuel chapter 6 the rise of David as priest. However, we need to keep in mind that David is not being a priest here. He's actually acting as a king was supposed to act. If you remember back in Exodus chapter 19, God told the people of Israel through Moses that they were a kingdom of priests. It would imply then that they would have a priestly king, which we certainly see codified later on, especially in the prophecies of Zechariah, as the priest is crowned and called the branch, using a Davidic term for the Messiah. And we see, obviously, Jesus being priest and king, alongside being prophet. But David here also functions as a prophet and a king, and it appears as a priest, although he's simply doing his job as the king. One of the duties of the king is to preserve the worship of God and to make sure that the priests are doing their job. So David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Since this is going to be the place that serves as his capital, it makes sense to have God's throne there as well as David's throne. Some people have suggested that David is actually just moving to solidify the people's allegiance to him in Jerusalem, which is certainly possible. It doesn't mean that because he's worshiping God that he's not also being politically advantageous, but at the same time, we do see his love for God is what motivates him to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and setting it up in a tent. We might even call this the Tabernacle of David, since it appears that there is still something located at Gibeon, because that is where Solomon will go after he is made king. He will go to Gibeon, where God will meet with him and give him wisdom. David here attempts to bring the ark into Jerusalem, but he doesn't do it the right way. In fact, David completely ignores the law of God in the transport of the Ark of the Covenant, which ends up killing Uzzah along the way when he touches the Ark of the Covenant. David originally sends the Ark of the Covenant to the house of Obed-Edom, but when the house of Obed-Edom is blessed, David wants that for himself, naturally. So he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, this time doing it correctly, according to the law of God. David may make a lot of mistakes, but he seems to learn from them as he does here. He sees the law of God, he sees the requirements of how you transport the ark, he transports it appropriately and brings it into Jerusalem. Along the way, he is dancing in a linen ephod. Some people have said, oh, he's dancing in his underwear, which on the one hand may seem correct, except that an ephod is what priests wear. And so the writer of Samuel is not including this to show that David has stripped himself, as Michael will later say, but instead that he is acting priestly by dancing in the ephod before the Lord, and, according to the text, offering sacrifices. He is serving as a priestly figure here. Again, this was something that Saul could have done all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 13 if Samuel had not said, wait for me 7 days. And that's really the issue. Not to mention the fact that Saul seemed to view the offering of sacrifices to God the same as divination, just one more superstitious thing that you needed to do before going into battle. Whereas here we see David's sincerity as he's worshiping God as the Ark of the Covenant is brought into Jerusalem. He's rejoicing. And then when Michal despises him and says, you made a fool of yourself, David reminds her, it doesn't really matter what I appear like, I'm worshiping God. And basically curses Michal, and she no longer has children, which again serves to end the line of Saul. Saul's descendants are getting smaller and smaller and smaller in number because they keep doing stupid things, such as insulting David. So here, David, in effect, curses Michal so that she will not bear a descendant, which is convenient because that descendant can't then claim to have a right to the throne because he's descended from both David and Saul. This kind of clears up a potential messy situation, but at the same time highlights theologically what David's emphasis really is. David is worshiping God first and foremost. The covenant with David is one of the most important covenants of the Old Testament. Not that any of them are unimportant, but this covenant is one of the last covenants outside of the new covenant mentioned in Jeremiah 31. As David says to God, God, I want to build you a house. And God instead responds to David, no, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to have your descendants be, in effect, my children, and they will sit on my throne forever. In some sense, this is an unconditional covenant. David is going to sin, but it doesn't break the covenant. They'll go into exile as a people, but it doesn't break the covenant. And yet it's not truly unconditional because there are conditions in the form of curses. If the person, this being the Davidic king, does not follow after God, God, he says, will punish him. Not take away the covenant, not take away the house of David, not utterly destroy them, but he will punish them with the floggings of men. Other kings will come along from other nations that will punish Israel for the sin of the Davidic king. And we do see this repeatedly in Israelite history, even in the stories of Solomon, that Solomon is punished by the attack of other kings because of the fact that he has left God and gone to worship other gods. Not very wise per se, but it is what Solomon ends up doing. So on the one hand, this is a grant more than a treaty or a covenant, and yet it is a covenant in the sense that there are expectations of what it is that David is supposed to do and what his descendants are supposed to do. This covenant also seems to form the foundation for Psalm 2, where God says, I have installed my anointed one on my holy hill. And he refers to the Davidic king in Psalm 2 as his son. Now, we certainly know from the New Testament that Jesus is not just God's son because he's the Messiah, because he's the king. He really is God's son. However, because of the understanding of Jewish religion, the Israelites, even at the time of Jesus, would have understood Jesus not as actually claiming divinity, but as claiming the fact that he was the anointed one. There are a couple places, however, where Jesus takes that further than the Israelites are comfortable with and actually claims to be divine, such as calling himself the I Am. Thus, we see Jesus is re-correcting or re-establishing what it really means in Israel that he is the Son of God. He's Davidic, he is from the Davidic line, so he is the adopted son as the one who will sit on the throne of David, but Jesus really is God's son. He's both the Messianic Son of God from Psalm 2, but also the actual Son of God. It's very ironic, which is part of why the Israelites miss it at the time of Christ. But this is the foundation of that here, as God promises to David that David will always have a son to sit on the throne, and that son will actually be God's son, which we begin to see in Solomon as he is called Jedediah, God's beloved, because that is God's son, again portrayed in Psalm 2. Following the covenant with David made by God in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see David respond in faith in the next few chapters. Immediately in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, David prays a prayer of thanksgiving to God for the incredible blessing. David is just amazed and blown away by what it is that God is doing for him. Then in chapters 8 and 9, we see David respond in action. Responding first militarily in action, David believes that God is with him because that's what God has promised. David doesn't believe he can be defeated, and he goes out and he defeats the nations handily. We also see, though, David extending grace to Mephibosheth. It's possible that Mephibosheth's name is Mephibaal, since Bosheth has to do with shame. It's possible that the Israelite writer of 1 Samuel changed Mephibaal's name to Mephibosheth so as to shame him, literally. It's also possible that Mephibaal received the nickname Mephibosheth after the death of Saul. We know that Mephibosheth was 5 years old when Saul died. It was 7 years from the time that Saul died until the time that David became king of all Israel. So that would suggest that Mephibosheth is at least 12 years old, the 5 plus the 7. However, we find out that Mephibosheth has a son named Micah. And since I don't think that many 12-year-olds were having children in Israel, it's presumable that Mephibosheth is quite older, which also suggests that David did not immediately make a covenant with Mephibosheth when David became king. Instead, this really seems to be a response later in David's life, as David is making a covenant with God, or more specifically, God is making a covenant with David. David, you don't have to worry about your line being broken by the descendants of Saul who come back and try to establish Saul's kingdom. Instead, recognize that I am with you and your descendants, and you, David, will always have somebody sitting on the throne. David is then freed to go and extend grace to Mephibosheth because he doesn't view Mephibosheth as a threat. So in that sense, it may be much later in David's life and much later in the time that he is waging war against other nations before he actually extends his grace to Mephibosheth. His kingdom, David's kingdom, has been firmly established before he goes and allows what could be a potential rival to come into his household. We continue to see this covenant play out with Mephibosheth, and we wonder, is it an unconditional covenant? On the one hand, no, it's not unconditional, because when David flees Israel, fleeing from Absalom, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, says that Mephibosheth thinks that God is going to give the kingdom back to the descendants of Saul. We find out later that this is probably a lie, and yet when David finds out that it's a lie, he restores everything that he took from Mephibosheth back to Mephibosheth. So in that sense, it's conditional. You have to be loyal to David in order to retain what is yours. But on the other hand, David is quick to forgive and quick to divide things up between Ziba and Mephibosheth, rather than worry about who said what and what said who. Instead, just simply saying, split it, at which point Mephibosheth says, yeah, that's fine. I'm just glad, David, that you are safe. So we see a relationship that develops between David and Mephibosheth over time, as Mephibosheth realizes David is not going to kill me. Instead, David is going to extend a covenant faithfulness because of the covenant that he made with Jonathan. So David here has experienced a covenant, an unconditional covenant or unconditional covenant with God, and then turns around and extends that same grace and favor towards somebody else who doesn't deserve it, somebody else who was unlikely, the house of Mephibosheth, part of the house of Jonathan. So we see the application of David's faith in the covenant of God here in his relationship with Mephibosheth, as again, it is completely out of the ordinary for you to have the son of your rival, your enemy even, who had a rival kingdom, to come and to hang out at your table. Not as a prisoner. Some people have suggested David was doing this so he could keep an eye on Mephibosheth, but it really seems that he's extending grace to Mephibosheth as he himself has experienced grace. Unfortunately, the far more famous parts of the life of David are the fall of the kingdom of David. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we have the story of David and Bathsheba. Very sad story as David pretty much throws away everything. He's accused by Nathan of taking, and that really seems to be the problem here. Not just adultery, but taking. God had given David all of his other wives, but this one David has gone and taken it for someone else. He took it from Uriah, one of his 30 mighty men whom he knew quite well. He takes Bathsheba, so that as he's asking the question, whose wife is that, or what woman is that over on the rooftop, he may be saying it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because he knows who it is. It's also possible, though, that we see an emphasis of the seeing or the inability to see, which we have had in 1 Samuel, that David actually can't see and doesn't know who that is, at which point the person that he asks, whose woman is that, basically says to David, David, you're an idiot. You know who that is. That's Bathsheba. So David can't see, and even when he does see and find out who she is, he doesn't see what he's going to do to himself and to his kingdom when he sins, which he does. He takes her, he murders Uriah, has an affair with Bathsheba. Her son will die, the first child that is born to David and Bathsheba, but the second one will be Solomon. And God will use that unusual, sinful even, union between David and Bathsheba to produce a very godly king, at least in the first part of his life, as he becomes the descendant and the successor to the throne of David. As a result, though, of David's sin, there are a number of consequences. We have Amnon, who rapes his sister Tamar in the next chapter, in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Absalom, who is the full brother of Tamar and not a half-brother like Amnon, goes and kills Amnon. We then have Absalom, who flees and then eventually comes back, but then eventually sets up his own rebellion against his father. Perhaps because he's upset that his father did not do justice for Tamar when Amnon raped her. Instead, David kind of ignores it. Perhaps Absalom just wants power. But for whatever reason, he goes and he sets up his own rival kingdom. It would appear to some degree that Amnon would have been king either way, since he was the next oldest in line after Amnon. Adonijah would have been a rival who will also set up a rival kingdom after David dies. But at least for now, Absalom is impatient and isn't willing to wait. And so he sets himself up as a ruler and has some success for a time, but eventually it will end in Absalom's death. After Absalom, we have Sheba, who also forms a rebellion in 2 Samuel chapter 20, and who takes the descendants of Saul and starts his own rebellion. But he too will be killed and will come to an end, ending the rebellions, or at least the rebellions that are mentioned in Israel, all because of the fact that David sinned with Bathsheba. As Nathan said, the sword will never depart from your house because of what you did to Uriah the Hittite. And we certainly see this. David continues to suffer the consequences. Even though his sin is forgiven, he suffers the consequences for the rest of his life. At the end of 2 Samuel, the life of David is beginning to wrap up. We're preparing for the succession, although we don't know who that's going to be at this point. We know from 1 Kings it's Solomon, but there's no indication of that here in 2 Samuel. We're beginning to tie a nice, neat bow on the lifetime of David. Here in 2 Samuel chapter 21, he eliminates the last threats of the line of Saul. executing them because of something that Saul did during his reign, which is odd because we're told that in the law that the sons are not supposed to be put to death for the sins of the father. It's a very unusual passage, one of the more difficult passages of the Old Testament. Why does David execute a group of people who are technically his nephews, since he's married to their aunt, Michal, and yet he allows them to be executed, to be killed, and for the Gibeonites to do it? And the Gibeonites request such an odd request, actually thinking that David was going to give them sons of Saul to kill in revenge, and yet that's what Saul does. Saul begins to take vengeance on the Gibeonites, so the Gibeonites take vengeance on Saul's family, and David allows it, in fact, enables it. Again, a very unusual story in an unusual situation, but it serves to get rid of any claimants who could possibly be left from the line of Saul, who would want to take the throne after David dies. In 2 Samuel 21 through 22, we read of the end of battles. David's not allowed to go out and fight with the men anymore. He's just simply too old. He cannot do it, and they're afraid that he's going to be killed. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, David responds by giving a great psalm, a great song, again, that serves as the bookend to 2 Samuel, really mirroring the song of Hannah back in 1 Samuel, and even mirroring some of the same themes. He's wrapping up his lifetime by giving his last will and testament, as it were, his last words, although we see him speaking in 1 Kings, but at least here in Samuel, wrapping up. And then we get to 2 Samuel chapter 24, which is the end of, well, we don't really know what it's the end of. It is probably one of the more bizarre endings of any book in the Old Testament. It's very similar to the book of Judges and how crazy the ending of the book of Judges is, where we end again with a cultic festival and the women in Shiloh being kidnapped. Fortunately, there's no widow being kidnapped here in Jerusalem. Instead, we have thousands upon thousands of people being killed by the angel of death because of what David has done. David numbers the people, demonstrating a pride, a self-confidence that he is able to defend Israel, that he, with his armies, is able to set up an empire, and God judges him accordingly. Even though Joab, of all people, tries to warn him, David still acts presumptuously in his pride. He doesn't pay the temple tax that he's supposed to for each man. He numbers them, which he's not supposed to do, and God judges him, allows David graciously to pick the type of punishment, but David is still responsible for the deaths of many of his people. Eventually, the plague is going to be ended when David goes to the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. There, David will buy from Araunah the threshing floor, which will become the site of the future temple. It's an odd story, and while there's a theological purpose, David having pride and dependence in his own power, and yet here buying the plot of land that will be the placement of the temple, which will be a constant reminder that you have no spiritual power and that you deserve to die. Irony there, and yet at the same time, it's a very odd way to end a book. It just leaves us hanging. We've bought a threshing floor, and now we're done. It doesn't really set the stage for 1 Kings, other than the fact that the temple is going to be built in 1 Kings. But again, a very unusual way to end a book. So it's the end of the book, it's the end of the chapter, it's the end of the story, although we're not really sure why. It's almost as though the writer of 1 Samuel knows that 1 Kings is coming, which again is very unusual because 1 Kings is written so much later than 1 Samuel. So this seems to have been predisposed by God for the writer of 2 Samuel to do this, to leave it kind of hanging, somewhat again in the spirit of Judges, but to leave the book hanging, knowing that something else is going to be coming down the line to fulfill that covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, but also to fulfill the covenant of God with Israel in establishing a temple. Well, that's the ending of our 6th lecture as we've reached the end of 2 Samuel. We'll look at the end of 2 Samuel in a little bit more detail in lecture chapter 7 as we begin to make our way into 1 Kings and the handoff from David to Solomon.